Our next speaker believes that one of the solutions to U.S. dependence on foreign supplies is choice and competition in the transportation sector. She's currently the chairman of the Set America Free Coalition and the co-director of the Institute for the Analysis of Global Security. Please welcome Korin.
To solve a problem, we first need to understand what it is. And I think one of the most misunderstood problems that Washington policymakers have been supposedly trying to deal with over the past several decades is energy dependence. First, we need to understand why we actually care about energy dependence, and I'm sure everybody here, especially in Houston, is perfectly well aware that when we talk about energy dependence, energy independence in the context of the United States, we're talking about oil, of course. When we talk about energy dependence, energy security issues in the context of Europe, we're also talking about natural gas because of Russian natural gas problems. When it comes to energy independence, the problem in the United States and in the rest of the world is not our level of oil consumption. It is not our level of oil imports. It is the fact that oil is a strategic commodity. It's a strategic commodity because it underlies our very way of life. And that's not a good thing, because at the same time that oil underlies our very way of life because of its virtual monopoly over transportation fuel, most of the world's oil reserves, at a time when we are, like it or not, in a war with radical Islam, most of the world's oil reserves are in countries in which radical Islam is on the rise. So we are not going to win the war on radical Islam as long as oil is a strategic commodity. Now, if we look to history, we'll see that there were numerous other strategic commodities on the world stage, and one of the most prominent ones was salt. Salt was a strategic commodity because it had a virtual monopoly over food preservation. And salt determined the stature of countries on the world stage and had an inordinate impact on the course of world affairs. Wars were fought over salt. Countries chose where to place colonies depending on where salt was abundant. Well, what happened? Napoleon, realizing that salt was a strategic commodity, armies move on their stomach. They needed salt to preserve their food, in order to be able to move your armies. Napoleon set up a prize to find an alternative to salt for food preservation, and within 10 years, a French chef developed the first version of canning. And then came improved versions, and then, as history moved forward, electricity and refrigeration, and now, can anybody tell me whether we import salt in this country? How much salt we import? Who the world's biggest salt reserve holders are? Do you care? You don't care. And if I told you we import a great deal of salt, would you say we have a salt dependence problem? No, that's what energy independence means. Okay, energy independence does not mean autarky. It doesn't mean walling yourself off from the global market. It doesn't mean not importing any oil. It means that oil simply stops being that important. Just like salt, it becomes something that you buy and sell, you use where it makes sense to use, but you really don't care where it comes from. It's just not that important anymore. So this is the problem that we're trying to solve, turning oil into just another commodity. My new book is actually titled Turning Oil into Salt. Okay? Now, how do we do that? First, oil's strategic status stems from its virtual monopoly over transportation fuel. Now here, let us call out our unfortunate political class, and I detest using that term, political class, but that's what we're faced with. Has a serious misconception going on. You very often hear politicians say, oh, if we only build more solar panels, windmills, or nuclear power plants, depending on which side of the aisle they're from, we're going to end our dependence on oil, right? or reduce it. They're either lying or they're ignorant. Okay, this was true in the 70s when we generated a significant portion of our electricity from oil. Today, only 2% of US electricity is generated from oil. Only 2% of our oil demand is due to electricity generation. It's a completely separate issue. Plug-in, let's say you have a plug-in hybrid or an electric car, plug it in today. 98% of the time, unless you're in Hawaii or Long Island or a small part of Florida, it's not running on oil. Okay, so a totally separate issue. And if you only keep one factoid in mind from everything I said today, please keep that in mind. Because on the way, before I went to the airport yesterday, I had a talk in Washington, D.C., and the first question was, what about if we build more nuclear power plants? So people, for some reason, have a really hard time getting their head around this. These are separate issues. There are all sorts of reasons to do different things with our electricity grid. But it's a separate question from stripping oil of its strategic status. There's another misconception that comes up a great deal. If you look at policy in Washington over the past several decades, depending on which side of the aisle folks are from, you get two types of approaches. Drill here, drill now, etc. Or use less. Reduce our consumption or increase our production. Nothing wrong on its face with either. However, will they make any difference at all? No, they will not. Why? Well, let's look at an experiment we've had over the past year or so of our economic situation. Economy tanked. What happened to oil consumption? Dropped by some 10%. Well, what did OPEC do in response? OPEC, the oil cartel, which sits on 78% of world oil reserves. We used less. What did they do? They throttled down production by 4.5 million barrels a day. At its peak, we had an oil market of around 85 million barrels a day. So we used less, they drill less. Now, what happened if we did what so many politicians want us to do, and I'm personally indifferent to, drill in Alaska, drill offshore? Would that make any difference? No, it's the same as efficiency. Reducing our consumption is exactly the same as increasing our production. Why? Look to history. What has happened every time we being non-OPEC countries, drill more? What do OPEC countries do? They drill less. We use less, they drill less. We drill more, they drill less. It's very simple. 35 years ago, OPEC, which I emphasize again, sits on over 3/4 of world oil reserves. 35 years ago, OPEC produced 30 million barrels of oil a day. You know how much they produce now? They produce less. They produce 29 million barrels a day. You know how much they produced at the height of the market? When oil prices were at their peak? Not very much more. So this is the situation. We have a cartel that's deliberately constraining production. This is why prices are higher than they otherwise ought to be. And at the same time, we have a situation where the members of this cartel and other players beyond the cartel, Russia is not a cartel member, but certainly not exactly a friendly player necessarily in the global situation. But let's specifically focus on OPEC. We have two countries in OPEC, one of which folks are very fond of talking about as a problem, and that's Iran, of course, the biggest sponsor of radical Shia Islam. But there's another country that's, in my view, even more problematic, and that's Saudi Arabia, the most primitive kingdom in the world, which sits on 1/4 of world oil production, a 1/4 of world oil reserves, most of the world's spare capacity of oil. And if anybody here thinks that either President Bush would be kissing the Saudi king or President Obama would be bowing to him, if that were not the case, then we have a disagreement. So Saudi Arabia, other problematic countries that would otherwise really be pariah states on the world stage because of their abuse of human rights, of women, of other religions, their sponsorship of terrorism, their proliferation of radical Islam. Other countries that are simply bad actors, like Venezuela. The country's not a bad actor, its leader is. Would have a very, very different status in the world, if not for their control of a significant chunk of world oil reserves. Now, we focused on what the problem is. Let's talk a little bit about what we can do to solve it. The problem is oil strategic status. We need to strip oil of its strategic status. We need to do that by breaking its virtual monopoly over transportation fuel. In order to do that, vehicles need to be platforms on which fuels can compete. You can have a more efficient vehicle, that's wonderful, but that's not going to solve the problem. Right? We use less, they drill less. You need a vehicle that's a platform on which fuels can compete. How do we do that? Let's talk about a number of things we can do to make that happen. First and most simple, an open fuel standard. An open fuel standard is very simple. It says most new cars sold in this country need to be flex fuel vehicles. A flex fuel vehicle is a car with an internal combustion engine and a liquid fuel tank. It can run on gasoline, and it can run on a variety of alcohol fuels. Alcohol doesn't just mean ethanol, and ethanol does not just mean corn. Alcohol can be methanol, for instance, that can be made from coal or natural gas or agricultural waste. In fact, China is focused on the alcohol methanol. So there are a variety of alcohols that you can use in a flex fuel vehicle. In this country, we've focused on ethanol, and corn ethanol in particular, because of the farm lobby. But that's a separate issue. Making a car, we can talk about it later if you want. I have a lot to say about the farm lobby. Making a car a flex fuel vehicle costs under $100. For GM to do it would be close to a zero cost. Okay? What you're doing, because alcohol is more corrosive than gasoline, is putting corrosion-resistant fittings in the fuel line and basically downloading a different algorithm to a chip on the car so it knows how to manage the burn depending on the fuel mix. That's it. It's very simple. That's why Brazil went from 0 to 70% of new cars being flex fuel vehicles in 3 years. And over 90% of new cars sold in Brazil today are flex fuel vehicles. It's a very simple technology. Now we have, I think, almost 6 million or so flex fuel vehicles in the US today. So people would say, well, we have the vehicles there, how come we don't have fuel at the station? Because 6 million cars out of our whole huge, enormous fleet of vehicles is a tiny drop in the bucket. And you have to put yourself in the mind of a business person that owns a fuel station and has, let's say, 10 pumps at that station. And you have to ask yourself, at which point is there a business case for that person to make one of those pumps an alcohol fuel pump? You can throw lots of taxpayer money at him. It's not going to make a difference until there's a business case to do that. If you have 10 pumps, you're not going to want to make one of those pumps an alcohol pump until you get to a point where, let's say, 15 or 20% of the cars in your area, not just of the new cars, but of all the cars in your area, can use that fuel. Otherwise, it's just wasted retail space. Okay, so to get to that point, to solve that chicken and egg problem, you need an open fuel standard. Because most new cars are flex fuel vehicles. After 2 or 3 years, you get to that 15-20% threshold where then it makes sense for the fuel stations to install the pumps or retrofit existing pumps, which is not terribly expensive. $20,000 to $30,000 to retrofit an existing pump, $60,000 to $70,000 to install a new one, and there's already a $50,000 tax credit. So, but people aren't going to use that unless the cars are there. Okay, let's backtrack a moment. We talked about liquid fuel choice. You know, there are lots of other alternative liquid fuels that I'm not going to talk about that some of you might particularly like. But I just wanted to illustrate that we're not talking about something superbly complex or futuristic here. This is very straightforward. We could have done it yesterday. I say yesterday because since 2006, the CEOs of the big three, which let us remember, came up to the Hill to ask and receive our money, not manna from heaven, but our money, to bail them out. Since 2006, they've been repeatedly saying they're willing to commit to make 50% of their new cars flex fuel vehicles by 2012. Well, Democrats and Republicans in the Senate and the House introduced a bill called the Open Fuel Standard that would do just that. And when push came to shove, they were not willing, and nobody pushed them to accept this as a condition for the bailout. So this is the dire and unfortunate political situation that we're dealing with. And it traverses partisan lines. The second thing we need to do, liquid fuel choice is one thing. But beyond liquid fuel choice, using electricity in our vehicles opens up our cars to the whole spectrum of energy sources from which electricity is generated, which we already said is essentially not oil, okay? Nuclear, solar, coal, wind, geothermal, hydro, natural gas, you name it, the whole list. How do you do that? I'm sure many of you know, but in case some of you don't, let's just do a brief run-up here. Plug-in hybrid vehicles. So all of you are familiar with hybrid vehicles, like the Prius hybrid vehicle. You have an internal combustion engine and a liquid fuel tank. You also have a battery, and that battery, to simplify, basically gathers the energy that would otherwise be dissipated as heat when you brake. And it saves it up and you use it when you're driving. So if you take a car, and don't add weight or power to that car, just take that exact car and hybridize it. It can be a big car or a small car. You'll get about twice the miles per gallon. But then all you're doing is using less, right? They'll just drill less. You need to go the next step. You need to soup up that hybrid and go to a plug-in hybrid. So in a plug-in hybrid, that battery is bigger. You still have your internal combustion engine, so you have the range that you're used to, 300-400 miles. But the battery is bigger, so it can store, let's say, 20 or 30 miles of charge. And that's good enough, because 50% of cars on the road in the US are driven 25 miles a day or less. So that's good enough. That gets you most of your local miles. So if you have a plug-in hybrid, most of your local miles done on electricity, what are you doing in terms of miles per gallon? Let's rethink the miles per gallon concept, okay? The miles per gallon, the fuel efficiency concept was set up after the oil embargo, fuel efficiency standards, after the oil embargo in the 70s. The purpose was to reduce our demand for oil. And for that, it's a perfectly good measure. But if your focus is stripping oil of its strategic value, the problem really isn't miles per gallon. It's miles per gallon of petroleum fuel. Okay? You understand that? It's miles per gallon of petroleum fuel. So you want to stretch each gallon of oil-based fuel with other stuff. So in a plug-in hybrid, you're stretching it with electricity. So you're getting 100 miles per gallon of gasoline. That's not like 100 miles per gallon. You're not translating the electricity into energy equivalent of gasoline. You're just stretching each gallon of gasoline with electricity. Take that plug-in hybrid and make it a flex fuel vehicle. And that flex fuel vehicle, you can run on 85% alcohol, but to make the math easy, let's say you have 80% alcohol and 20% gasoline in your liquid fuel tank. Now what have you done? You've stretched each gallon of gasoline further by another factor of 5, so you get this bizarre-sounding figure of 500 miles per gallon of gasoline. That's not 500 miles per gallon. You know, it's not a miracle. It's not some incredible new technology. It's just saying you've taken the energy pie that used to move your car, and now a very small sliver of it comes from oil. This is how we break oil's monopoly over transportation fuel. This is how we strip oil of its strategic value. Now, if we don't do this, then we will remain in a world in which Torquemada, remember him? Torquemada sits on the jugular of the global economy. And we will continue our unfortunate decline. And I say continue because of something really heartbreaking to me that really is illustrative of where we are, that happened in Congress not too long ago, which, as you know, for those of you that have a TV, our TVs moved from analog to digital, right? This was a mandate by Congress that if you want to keep watching TV, you either have to change your TV or get a little converter box subsidized with taxpayer money, $80 vouchers, right? It was a mandate by Congress to change the way we watch TV. So to me, it is heartbreaking and kind of reminiscent of the fall of the Roman Empire that our Congress could get up the will to impose a mandate on the way we watch TV because bread and circuses are so very important, but couldn't get its head around to focusing on stripping oil of its strategic status by setting up an open fuel standard. That is heartbreaking to me. So I ask you, all those of you that are politically involved, to talk to your members of Congress, your representatives and your senators, to tell them to throw away their stupid speeches on energy independence, because they all have speeches and they do nothing with them, and to actually focus on policy that will make a difference. Because if they don't, you know, if you buy a car today, it's going to be on the road for some 16 years. Every year you delay, every year we delay this, carry it forward 16 years down the line. That's the world we're going to be in. Worse than the world we're in today. A world where not 78% of world oil reserves are controlled by OPEC, and not 40% of world oil production is provided by OPEC, but a world in which they really have us over a barrel. So I urge you all to do your part, and I'd be very glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Your passion for fixing this problem is really an inspiration, so I thank you for that. I have two questions for you. You mentioned that oil is a strategic commodity. What are the problems with the possibility that there will be other strategic commodities in the future, like neodymium, for example, used in the making of hybrid batteries? The neodymium mines are all in bad player countries also. So is there any incentive, any structure we can put into place so that others don't take over where oil leaves off?
Well, actually, that's the last chapter in the book, which looks at what are the next energy, the strategic commodities when it comes to energy. And look, let's be very blunt here. When you look at, for instance, the rare earth elements, okay, this whole family of elements that's necessary for everything from defense, manufacturing, to this whole renewable energy world. This is way beyond transportation, but renewable energy world, whether you're talking about electric motors, batteries, windmills, etc. The entire world's production of rare earth elements, do you know where it is? China. We have a huge amount of rare earth elements in this country. Are we mining anything? The mining in this country is exactly zero. So we have the capacity to, let's say, cut that problem off at the pass, which means there's no reason to have a geostrategic issue when it comes to rare earth elements or lithium, okay? But we will force there to be a reason if we don't open up our eyes and say, if we want to change the energy equation, we can't say no to everything in this country. We do actually need to start producing some things domestically. Otherwise, we can be dependent on China, and that's fine. I'd much prefer to be dependent on China than on Saudi Arabia, but that's just me.
One more quick question for you. You've devoted your life to this message. Where are you finding the most political traction, and where are you finding the least political traction?
You know, we've made an enormous amount of progress when it comes to plug-in hybrids, and I think the reason is very simple, because the policy that was necessary for plug-in hybrids was tax credits, and it's not that hard to get tax credits passed in Congress. So that was easy. We brought a couple plug-in hybrid cars, along with CalCars in California, Set America Free and CalCars. If you're familiar with this group, CalCars in California, very good group. We brought them to Capitol Hill in 2006, and senators and representatives rode around and got excited, and then took several years, but plug-in hybrid tax credits were passed. But getting an open fuel standard in place, despite the fact that liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans are co-sponsors of this legislation, has been very, very difficult. Very difficult, because you're asking somebody to do something. Look, no industry wants a new mandate. Even if it has said, these are the numbers, this is what I can do, I'm perfectly willing to do this, they still don't want to be told to do that. And frankly, I don't like government intervention in the economy. But here we have a situation where if you do not have an open fuel standard, you know, when people say, oh, we shouldn't be picking winners. Well, I'll tell you this. If you don't have an open fuel standard, you are picking a winner. You are picking a winner. You're picking to maintain the monopoly of petroleum, gasoline, and diesel, okay, over transportation fuel. You're picking to block out any other competitors from the market. Every alternative liquid fuel, now that the dollar has tanked, is competitive at $60 a barrel oil. It used to be competitive at $45 a barrel oil, but new framework, $60 a barrel. So why did oil go to $147 a barrel? Because you can't put the fuel in your car. So competition can't work. Okay, whether you're talking about methanol from coal or even ethanol from corn. Another issue I didn't talk about, we have an ethanol tariff in place. Ethanol tariff, we have a 54-cent a gallon tariff on ethanol imports, sugarcane ethanol imports. Why? Because we have an incredibly powerful domestic farm lobby. If we remove that tariff, then all of a sudden a lot of countries, some 100 countries around the world with a suitable climate for growing sugarcane, can become ethanol exporters, or certainly produce it for their own consumption as well. But we're not going to remove that tariff politically until we have an open fuel standard in place.
Great. Thank you so much, Ann. Another round of applause for Ann.